If I were to tell you a story about my favorite uncle or about my favorite cousin, I bet you probably wouldn't think twice, but if I were to mention my favorite child, some eyebrows might be raised. For the very pious and over-churched among us, it can be the same with the Bible. Like, it's okay to have a favorite prophet, it's okay to have a favorite parable, but maybe you shouldn't really have a favorite gospel. So I will not say that Luke's gospel is my favorite, especially since it's Easter Sunday and because we just heard a reading from the Gospel of John. But I will say this. If one of your kids just sings like an angel and the other one can't carry a tune, it's okay to just be aware of that, right? You can notice. Because if that's okay to say, then I'll go ahead and say that Luke can write. Luke knows how to tell a story. And in Luke's story, the women get to the tomb, and suddenly there appear two men in dazzling clothes, and these guys who are angels or whatever they are, they know exactly what's going on. And they get right to the point and they say the right thing. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Now, I want you to compare that with what we just heard a minute ago in the Gospel of John. Now, the setting is essentially the same. These women in Luke, or in John, it's just Mary Magdalene alone, but either way, these women are destroyed by grief. It's the worst day of their lives. And not just grief, but terror. Because grief is what we feel when somebody we love dies peacefully and painlessly and full of days, and it's just a different kind of thing when your intimate friend, who is also your spiritual leader, is detained, subjected to a sham, politically motivated trial, tortured, and brutally murdered by an imperial state. And all of this is done as a warning to you and your people to stay in line. That's where these women are in the graveyard that early morning. That's where Mary Magdalene is. And apparently for John, the risen Christ has a very sick sense of humor because he just straight up pranks her. He walks up and says, "Oh, who are you looking for? Who do you think she's looking for?" The day before yesterday, when we gathered here, all in black with no flowers and no candles and no organ music, Peter said in his sermon that for Pilate, who had condemned countless people to the cross in service of the empire, for him there was nothing special about the day of Jesus' crucifixion. It was just another day at the office, just another Friday. And not just for Pilate, but really for most everybody. The whole dreary, grinding business of Jerusalem ground on. It was a tense city in which the imperatives of trade and military supremacy drove the forces of the empire to just enough brutality to keep this local subjugated people with their strange religion in their place. But not enough brutality to spark an all-out war because that could be costly. It would demand resources, it might disrupt economic gain. So that's what was going on Good Friday for the forces of empire. But here's the thing. That's what was going on the third day too. Nobody noticed? Nobody noticed this mysterious thing that had happened in the night? The empire didn't notice. The reign of terror was not lifted. The miserable masses of the poor and the oppressed did not wake up on that morning and celebrate death's defeat. Nobody, and especially nobody important, is paying attention to some poor, misguided, unknown woman crying in a graveyard. Except the risen Christ. And maybe we're called to pay attention too. Because on that Sunday morning, as far as anybody could tell, the empire was still firmly in control. In fact, it would be another 40 years after Jesus' death, 40 years of political and ethnic and religious conflict between the Jewish people and the occupying forces of Rome, 40 years of brutality, 40 years of crucifixions, before Rome finally decides that they've had enough and it's time to drop the hammer, and in the year 70, they utterly destroy the temple that had been the focal point of Jewish life and worship at that time for 600 years. So we gather year by year on Easter Sunday and week by week on the day of resurrection to proclaim Jesus' victory over the forces of sin and death. But on that morning that Mary wept at the tomb, the empire still thinks it's winning. It doesn't know that death has been defeated. It would be centuries before that particular empire knew anything that it would recognize and experience as defeat. And today the empires still think they're winning. And we need to pay attention to where the risen Christ might show up so that we might be among the few who notice something else going on. When Alexei Navalny dies in a Russian prison and nobody in authority feels any real pressure to tell the truth about what happened there, the forces of empire think that they are winning. And when upwards of 1 million Uyghur Muslims are held in prisons and in concentration camps in Western China, and the outside world has virtually no access, no information, the forces of empire think that they're winning. And when government agents who have been sworn to uphold a constitution that guarantees civil liberties and due process, when those agents are able to round people up from the street and deliver them directly to foreign prisons without stopping by a courtroom, the forces of empire think that they are winning. Thus it is today, and thus it was on that morning in Jerusalem, and you would have to have a steely resolve, such a resolve as might be mistaken by the world for delusion, to maintain that the forces of empire have been defeated, that they're not winning. And countless of us unknowns with our strange religion that is alien to the forces of empire still weep at the tombs of our dead. So whom are you looking for? The disciples, most of them anyway, and many more of the followers in the concentric circles beyond the disciples around Jesus, were looking for a much more immediately satisfying victory than an empty tomb on a Sunday morning that nobody noticed. They were looking for a rebel leader. That's what Palm Sunday was about. Here he comes. He's going to overthrow the empire and take back the throne of David, and the forces of sin and death will know that they have lost. We see that in Peter with his sword in the garden. It is go time. The battle is met. We see it in the disciples who say to Jesus when he predicts his passion and death and resurrection, and they pledge their fealty and say, I will go with you even unto death. But the thing for which they are willing to die is a victory that will show the empire that they have lost. When it comes to the victory that Jesus actually claims, the disciples have melted away. So they are looking for a rebel leader. And Mary, in the graveyard, is looking for a dead body, which she fears has been stolen and desecrated. So I want to go back for a minute to the difference between Luke's story and John's story to remind you that in 40 days on a Thursday in May, we will celebrate the Feast of the Ascension. And those of you who know your Gospels will know that this is a story that is told only by Luke. And I said Luke knows how to tell a story, and his story is linear. Luke solves the problem of what happens to the body of Jesus with the ascension. All the Gospels have resurrection appearances, and then the question is, what became of that body? Did Jesus die again? Is he still showing up? Where is he? Well, Luke has him ride into heaven on a cloud, which in a worldview where heaven is a physical place is a great resolution. It makes perfect sense. The body of Christ no longer visits us in bodily form the way it did in those resurrection appearances because he's off in heaven. And Luke has important points to make by telling this story, but the downside is that he's telling us this won't happen again. He's telling us that the ascended Christ, who is the King of heaven, who has defeated death, is far off from us. Thus, my newfound appreciation for the Gospel of John. When I read this note from a commentator, and this may be familiar to Bible scholars, but it hadn't struck me in this way before. In John, the subsequent resurrection narratives, meaning all the times that Jesus appears after this time in the garden with Mary, are presumably to be understood as manifestations of the ascended Jesus. Not pre-ascension, but manifestations of the ascended Jesus. Manifestations of the Jesus who is the ruler of heaven. Manifestations of the Jesus who has defeated death. And you know these stories from John. Jesus appears that very evening, that very same evening, the day that begins with Mary at the tomb. Jesus appears in the room to the disciples, and we know this because John tells us that Thomas wasn't there, so he doesn't believe. Then he appears again the next week, and Thomas is there. And then he appears again at the seashore, and they cook some fish on some charcoal. And John tells us this, that he does many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book. John says that, many other signs which are not written in this book. And there's no ending point where Jesus goes far away from us in John's telling. So if these signs that Jesus does in the presence of his disciples who are gathered here today continue on earth underneath the notice of the powers of sin and death and empire, then the question now is as urgent as ever. The question that the risen Jesus put to Mary at the tomb, the question that John, I think, is putting to us, because John was enough of a writer to know perfectly well that Jesus already knew who Mary was looking for. But John challenges us. Whom are you looking for? Are you looking for the rebel leader? I know that I can get angry enough to be looking for the rebel leader because I want the forces that I would like to see defeated to know that they have been defeated. Are we looking for a dead body that we can honor? Because I have been deep enough in sorrow to simply yearn for that. But if you're looking for the King of heaven, who has defeated the powers of sin and death, you're going to need to look up. Look for him loose in the world and appearing unbidden in unexpected places. And you're going to want to try to find that kind of steely resolve that the world might mistake or dismiss for delusion, and take hold of this strange religion that we call Christian faith, that is alien to the empires of the world, And you'll want to try to find a way in the midst of this troubled and violent world to proclaim that, in the words of the hymn, the powers of death have done their worst and have been defeated. The empire might not have noticed yet, but do we? At the tomb, Jesus told Mary not to hold on to him, not to try to keep him there at the tomb. His work there is done. Amen.